Great. Well, welcome everyone. Glad to have you all here today. Thanks for joining us. We've got around 45 minutes to get stuck into quite a lot of content. So I'm going to kick off quickly and introduce our panel. Dave Kelly, CEO Master Builders. Welcome. Great to have you here, Dave. And I just thought before we get into the nitty gritty, couple of reflections on lockdown. So can you let us know favourite lockdown meal and maybe a suggestion for a movie or TV series that you've enjoyed?
I'm fairly traditional sort of taste. For two though, because I haven't got a Netflix, so I'll go for two meals instead. Love a roast chicken, but also a mild curry, or not too mild, but a decent curry.
Right. Yep. I would have gone down well last night with the weather. Excellent. Thanks, Dave. Great to have you here. Bruce, I'll move on to you, CEO of Fletcher Building Distributions. You're covering Placemakers, McEwen, and Placemakers Frame and Truss. Bruce, great to have you here. So can you one-up Dave on the meal front?
Favourite meal was probably the one my university student son cooked, primarily if it's a rare event. It actually tasted that as well, so yeah, that would be my favourite one.
And got a tip for a movie or a TV series?
Tip would be I've been watching a bit of the Paralympics actually on June. Some of the things that athletes, massive challenges, and what they can achieve is quite beholden to actually watch. So yeah, fantastic doing.
Excellent, nice reminder that's obviously going on, and we've got some athletes doing incredibly well. Thanks, Bruce. And finally, Stephen, over to you. So Stephen Voyle, who is Managing Partner of Context Architects. Stephen, welcome. How about you? What have your insights been? What have you had to enjoy over the last couple of weeks?
Well, we've taken to exploring lots of different fish meals in the house. I guess it's been a bit of fun. Haven't really had a lot of time to watch any Netflix or movies, but have taken to watching the golf. The recent one was the BMW Cup. It was pretty good.
Yes. Yep. Great. Okay. Well, thank you for that. Yes, plenty to see. Right. In terms of today, what we're going to cover off as a team is really we've got two key parts to the webinar. We're going to talk about opening up. So what it actually means with getting back into level 3. It's been a while since we've done that, so we're quickly going to refresh that. We'll think about how the supply chain is opening up, and particularly we want to touch on how do we operate. We've never had this before. We've got part of the country still in level 4 and the rest of the country with some freedom, some ability to operate. Then we want to look at the bigger picture. So we've recently published a report as of this morning around the status of the supply chain at the moment. Some are calling it a crisis. So we'll look at some information there and think about a forecast. So what have we got to look forward to? Staffing's always been a topic of interest, so we'll touch on that and then think about what are the proactive things that we can do as industry to make sure that we're operating as efficiently as possible. Now, we've got nearly 800 of us online, so it's a great number for us to be considering some of these key concepts around what we can do quickly and what are the longer term solutions that might require a little bit more thought and effort. So firstly, let's just think about what happens with level 3. So if I look at total building consents, this is for new residential builds over the last 12 months, gives us an idea that around 54% of all new dwelling building sites are situated outside of Northland and Auckland. So we can assume that roughly half of building sites could open tomorrow if they choose. And then if we then think ahead to Friday, once Northland hopefully comes into level 3, we're approaching 60%. So a significant part of the country is opening up. Now, what does level 3 mean? Well, for general consumers, it's level 4 takeaways, but for the building industry, it's a considerable change. So why don't we kick off, Dave, and thinking about a quick reminder around what operating at level 3 requires and what we should be planning for.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. So you've got up on screen the Chaz NZ website. That's the critical site to go to, just to remind you, and also to check on whether there's any changes from when we were last in level 3. And so they have protocols for each of the levels. Level 3 is the one we're talking about, and they have protocols for commercial, residential, and also for display homes. So if you click into those, you'll get more detail. Really, I think quite user-friendly. So there's a 5-step guide for returning to work at level 3. And they are quickly, before arriving on site, what you need to do in terms of preparing a management plan, site entry requirements, and including restricting the site operations. What do you need to do on site in terms of physical distancing? When do you, what sort of work should you be wearing? Masks or face coverings, I should say, and cleaning of the site, leaving site, making sure everyone checks out. And also there's a management protocol. So there's a manager's checklist, which is really helpful. So that's the best information I think that's available. It's the one that has been recognised by government. The other thing is, I will quickly say that has changed since last time. We're now in a position where we can get vaccinations. So certainly to all our members, and I think to anyone in the industry, encourage you to facilitate your workers to get vaccinations, including things like giving them time off to go and get the vaccination. Don't make it hard for them. Some people do suffer some discomfort the day after the second one. So be a little bit understanding of that without being silly about it. But facilitate people where you can. And just for those who are still in level 4, there are also protocols both there and on the Construction Accord website on essential workers. And they may change a little bit over time. It's still pretty tight. But in relation to vaccinations, there are priorities and there are moves underway to try and facilitate on an industry-wide level people in the construction industry to be able to get access to vaccination.
Great. Hey, thanks, Dave. Now, just a reminder that we do have the chat function on. So if you've got any comments or questions, please use that. We won't be using the raised hand or Q&A. If we move on, Bruce, thinking about the supply chain opening up in level 3. So Placemakers and industry experience behind you. What do you want to tell us about how you see that unfolding?
Thanks, Matt. It's certainly, for our industry, it's definitely not level 4 takeaways. What we see at level 3 is outside those Auckland boundaries in Auckland, hopefully soon, is businesses opening back up with strict level 3 protocols, but essentially enabling our industry to get going. The issues we'll start to see, I think, there's a couple that come together quite quickly. Firstly is that most of the sites around the country shut down pretty quickly. Some were shut prior to the 6 p.m. announcement. Some manufacturing sites were mid-shift. So just going to take a day or two to get everyone back up and running again. It'll just get a few wobbles, if you like. It's a little bit of patience to get back into the rhythm, if you like. Of course, there's also the issue around Auckland still being closed. I think you've already mentioned it, Matt, the fact we're going to have the split level for the first time. And not only is a lot of the construction or consenting activity based around Auckland or Auckland centric, so too is a lot of the manufacturing or gateway distribution from offshore products. So it's going to be a really interesting dynamic as to just how operating at level 4 is going to work.
So with that in mind, let's just assume with Auckland and level 4 for another 2 weeks, let's just think about what impact that's going to have on all of that activity outside of the Auckland region.
Yeah, I mean, essentially it means that Auckland warehouses and manufacturers are largely closed unless there's an exemption being granted. Of course, where it is level 4 and whether it's for urgent or essential business, and there are a number of sites that are operating, for example, rebuilding hospitals, those sorts of activities. There's definitely stuff being distributed, but I think the thing that everyone needs to be aware of is supply chain was pretty low on stock prior to going into COVID, so there are potential disruptions. We're monitoring all our suppliers across the supply chain. We're aware that a number have applied for exemptions from MB to open to operate. At this stage, not a lot of responses coming through. So I think what we're going to see, particularly in these next few days, is that we're going to see people really coming up to speed or coming to grips with just what it means to operate at level 4 and level 3.
Gotcha. So just what we're clear with, obviously sites shut down quickly, not a lot of stock in the supply chain, and sounds like there's been a number of requests for exemptions to operate in level 4, but from what you're hearing, there's not a lot of those have been granted. Is that a
from
good
what we've
summation?
seen from our suppliers, not yet. It's in process, so it doesn't mean to say they won't be granted, but we've yet to see a lot of exemptions being granted across the supply chain.
Yes, yep. And Bruce, have you got any experience with that? I've got to see a question. Is there any help with applying for exemptions to MB? So
I wish there was an easy answer, or we've managed to find a simple process, but not yet.
Okay, all right. Well, so yes, this is a new territory, having the country split with part in lockdown, and once Northland, when that opens up, and we're thinking about timber supply, the ability to be able to actually get product from Northland across Auckland. There'll be a number of developments here. So obviously a bit of patience and planning is going to be required as we work through this. Great, so thanks, Bruce. I just want to now touch on some data that we've just released this morning in our supply chain report. And I would like to say a big thank you to Brands who made this report possible. So we certainly appreciate their support from the Building Levy Fund. We surveyed 240 suppliers, and that was in mid to late July. And we asked them questions really around the current state of the supply chain, some of the factors they're experiencing, and what they see in the near future. So they all had issues with supply chain, and we can see there it didn't matter what size firm they were. This is by revenue here. On average, 79% were experiencing delays and issues. When we asked them about some of the factors of those, a couple of things. One, when they looked at the demand, so the local demand coming from our local New Zealand construction industry, 61% of suppliers said there was a significant increase in demand for their product. Conversely, when they looked at their ability to be able to supply, 17% said that the product they could get their hands on had significantly decreased. 35% said that decrease was a slight decrease. So on one hand, we've got a booming local market, but we've got a tightening supply chain in terms of product availability. We then asked, what does the next 6 months look like? And we can see that the demand appears still to be very strong. There's lots of forecast information that supports that. And when we look at the supply side, we can still see that there are some constraints around material availability, but less than what we have seen. But still leads us to draw the conclusion we're going to have a market that will need to be managed closely. We also asked about costs. So 50% of those surveyed had significant increases in the cost of their products. And when we looked then at their ability to be able to pass it on to the market, we can see that number's a lot smaller. We think that's due to the fact that there's a commitment to fixed term contracts, but also there's a lag time before they can pass on pricing to their customers. So we can still expect there to be some increases in costs of materials arriving here in New Zealand, and expect the price to builders, merchants, and end consumers to also increase. Again, there's full detail of this of the report, which is free to download off the EBOSS.co.nz website. Let's look a little bit closer at particular categories. So here we're looking at comparing the cost that the supplier bought the product in at and what they can then sell the product at. So let's look at a particular category. I'm going to pick enclosure. Let me just come back here. So in the last 6 months, we can see that on average, there was a 17% cost increase to the supplier. And over that period of time, they managed a 12% price increase. So 17% cost increase, and they put their price up on average 12% to their consumers. So when we then look ahead at the next 6-month period, and again, let's look at that enclosure category. We can see over the next 6 months, we can see a further expectation of 9% cost increase and a price increase to the market of 6%. So again, if we're thinking about a cladding product, we can see that over that 12-month period, last 6 months and the next 6 months, we've got a 26% increase in costs and an 18% increase in price. So we need to watch whether or not that means that our supply chain's less profitable, we're actually having to eat some margin, or whether that price increase will continue after the 6 months. Lead times, no surprise that we've had significant increase in lead times in the last 6 months. We look at the next 6 months, that's going to continue. So again, patience and project management will be a big requirement in terms of dealing with that supply. There's been a lot of talk about local manufacturing. Survey data tells us 70% of all products sold in New Zealand are imported as finished products. Of the remaining 30%, majority of those rely on imported components that can't be sourced locally. So we are highly exposed to that international supply chain. So though local manufacturing is a component, we still need to ensure that the freight constraints particularly are well managed. Freight's a complex issue. There's a number of factors. Again, we cover all that in the report. Also want to just touch on what the global construction market is doing. So the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors have just released a report around global construction activity, and they point to 3 countries that have had good growth in the last 12 months. New Zealand, Australia is well documented, but also Egypt. Not exactly sure of the building program in Egypt, but those are the 3 countries that have had significant increase in workload. You can actually expect with the fast vaccine rollout, a number of other countries to join us. So we need to think about what impact that'll have on the availability of product to be able to be brought into the New Zealand market. When we look at the larger markets, we can see that the US is forecast to go into a 15-year housing boom, and both China and India both look to have considerable growth forecast for the next 12 months. So in terms of access to product, there's a large construction industry that New Zealand makes up a small percentage of. By GDP, that's around 14 billion in USD. We look at actual real construction data, we think that's closer to around 30 billion. But still, when we think about the anticipated growth, works out to be around 28 times our entire industry. So good relationships and good control over access to continued supply is going to be very important going forward. Okay, so that's, if you'd like to see more data, you can download that off our homepage, eboss.co.nz. But also on in the report, there's a number of things that we can do as an industry right now that can actually help us be more efficient, not only in the short term, but longer term as we deal with a number of factors that we've quickly outlined here. So I'll cut to our panel now. We've got sort of 5 key areas that we'd like to concentrate on. And let's start with staffing. I'll stop sharing now, Dave, and I'll throw to you. Do you want to give us some your thoughts on what you're seeing with the current labour market and the advice that you've been giving to your members and to wider industry?
I guess there's there's 2 or 3 things here. There is some good stuff happening with apprentices, but we know that that doesn't solve the current problem. That's going to solve the problem in maybe 3 years' time, because they don't fill the gap for experienced construction tradespeople or managers. Secondly, we've got, we're at a peak load of work that we haven't had for many, many years. And then, of course, the borders are closed, because traditionally we've relied on being able to fill that peak by bringing people in. I think we just have to face reality right now. The borders are not going to suddenly open up in the next few months. There are a limited number of places available for construction, but they will tend to be the high-end specialists. There is some discussion going on with government at the moment, but ultimately that will be limited. And what we also need to recognise is that every industry is crying out for skilled people. So we are one of many industries, and the government and the MIQ places can't currently cope. Hopefully that will change over time, obviously, as we get vaccination, et cetera, et cetera. But I think in the meantime, we just have to recognise that we're not going to have a sudden influx of people. So how do we manage projects, whether it's people or product supply and delays, and how do we plan further ahead as much as we can? There may be some things that can be done by working cooperatively with others to share resources. I'm talking about people, where there may be particular, you may have a down period or you're a peak. That may help around the edges, but I think the real issue is simply having to plan further ahead and understand that there will also be upward pressure on wages. There is some poaching going on, particularly in commercial. So you need to do what you can to make sure that you look after your people and keep them. But there is no easy solution, Matt.
Yep. Bruce and Stephen, do you want to touch on any points there?
I think David says it pretty well. Look after your people. It's tight, not only in our sector, across all sectors. And so whatever you do, make sure that your team is close, you know where they're at, and expect it to not get better quickly. So plan accordingly.
We agree with to look after your people. We also there's a high degree of movement for highly technical people at the moment in all industries, and so we're sort of taken the opinion of that exactly the borders aren't going to open anytime soon, and there's less people available. So it's actually just the planning and telling people, actually, we can't start your work until 2022, and actually plan it in and have those conversations early, and then look after our people and stick with the same team.
A very good point just come up on the chat about mental health and looking after people's health through this. We can talk about supplies and pressures, but at the end of the day, we're a people industry, and we need to make sure that we utilise all the opportunities to really look after and check to make sure people are okay.
Bruce, you're doing a good job keeping up with the chat line here. We've got lots of great questions, so well done, keep them coming.
Just on one of the questions, I saw someone said ASENS has got 60 spots at the moment, maybe they could share. That's not quite right. There are 60 spots for construction generally, and Master Builders is working with ASENS plus Institute of Architects and civil contractors. So the 4 of us are working together on putting forward some different proposals to government. So there is I think some good collaboration going on.
Yep. Paul, I see your note saying that you're aware of some Auckland suppliers who are dispatching stock to retailers from today. Presume that cannot be legal. Well, really, for them to be able to do that in level 4, they do need to have an exemption. So that needs to be pre-approved. So I'm assuming they're operating on that basis. All right, let's move on. So I want to talk a little bit more around what's the best approach for new projects. So what are we doing in terms of identifying what are the things we can control and how we're best working with clients, subcontractors and main contractors, to deliver projects successfully. So So gentlemen, who wants to kick this off? Stephen, how about, should we start with you?
Well, yeah, so traditionally with design and consenting and construction, it's quite a vertical traditional process. So we would go through about 55 or 60% of the design process through to end of detailed design with the target of tendering and then taking the best price. In a market like this, where we're all very busy and the supply chain is all choked up, we need to sort of turn that on its head and have the people that are influencing what we specify involved at the beginning. And there's various different ways we could do that. You can enter into an ECI or early contractor engagement, design build. So in the UK, the majority of projects there are delivered with the planning piece taken care of with your client. But the second part is you're then novated to a contractor who's involved very, very early on. The other way is you could actually look at fast tracking. So means multiple consents. So it's looking at your projects and going, not one consent, you might split it up into multiple consents and say, hey, you've got enabling works, which is everything in the ground. You've then got structure, you might have facades, and then you have everything else. And yes, there's some more cost up front, but it allows for early planning and allows for the contractors to be able to get engaged early in a project.
Thanks, Stephen. Dave, Bruce, any comments there?
Yeah, I'd just reinforce what Stephen said. We've seen a lot of customers appreciate consenting process is not easy, but breaking down bigger projects into sub-projects just to enable greater certainty. Earlier engagement as well around sourcing, around pricing as well, particularly with prices moving the way they are.
Yeah, and I'd reiterate that. I've heard both from architects and builders who thought about how they break that down, thinking about what they can control, but also thinking from the client point of view, and now I'm just talking about residential really, they're also anxious about what's going on. So if you can break that down for them and say, here's some things that we can fix the price on, here's the things we can't, because they're out of it, and just really be honest about that. Because what we see is where people get into trouble is where they don't communicate early enough. And sometimes you feel like you're saying the same thing again and again, but that's the reality. So I think the advice from Stephen in particular is really good. And think about how you change the way and break it down into simpler parts of what you do.
We'll move on. The next comment was really around just project management. So we've talked a lot about, communication, but, the concept of early contractor engagement, how we can actually bring people into the fold earlier, particularly if we're having to incorporate longer lead times, material supply. Stephen, should we start with you again? Again, as architect, you're first involved in putting the concept together.
Yeah, I think we touched on it just before. Say you take a design build process and you actually got a contractor coming in early for, you might have the planning all sorted. You might have actually tendered on P&G and margin, and you set those rates early. But having the contractor there will tell you, suddenly you go, hey, we need the windows worked on now because there's a 15-week supply time for that. And so you're working on the windows in the envelope right at the beginning of the project, rather than working on what color the walls are going to be painted. So we're actually prioritizing what is needed earlier on. And you could look, and the contractors are doing that all the time by putting these programs together. But what we don't usually see, we don't see these programs until 55% through the process. So the other one is actually consenting. One idea there of breaking it up. The other one is a really good piece of work that our team does is you look at it, not looking at consenting as a tick in the box. It's actually bringing the council along, and it's actually educating them about what we're trying to do. And so demonstrating how the design is complies with the code. So doing that early on, and just like a resource consent, you might have a pre-app meeting. You'll have pre-application meetings with council around building code. And so it just then mitigates any risks later on when you lodge that, and hopefully you don't get long building consenting times.
Anything else there, gentlemen?
Just from the builder's point of view, the early engagement is critical. Builders frequently are frustrated when they receive a design, they see something that they don't think is going to really work. It just wastes time really for everyone, as opposed to bringing the builder in earlier from a buildability point of view. And so I think, there's plenty of evidence to show that ends up with a better result for everyone.
Yeah, I think the earlier you start, the earlier you can plan. We've spoken already about a very constrained market. It's not going to solve itself quickly. It's not a short-term blip. It's going to be with us for a wee while. So the quicker you plan, the more you order in advance, the easier. Not to be totally easy, but the easier it gets, because you can actually start to book materials long in advance of what you normally do. So that ECI process is critical. That's where it starts.
Just quickly checking on the questions here. Any guidance on where you can find the exemption form on the MB site? I haven't seen it. We look, if we've got any further information on that, we can provide a general update, but appreciate the comment. Let's move on to how we can actually cooperate with the supply chain effectively. So what can we be doing in terms of, I've seen some notes come through in the chat line around engaging product suppliers earlier, thinking about the bringing the contractor in at an earlier stage, and ideas around how we can make sure that projects can run smoothly once we're on site. Stephen, should we start with you again? It's quite logical, the architect.
Specification and materials. Obviously, we're looking at materiality and all that from a planning perspective and resource consent. And then we start to look at the strategies of how buildings are put together, and beyond that, say, in developed design. And that's where we're really starting to look at materials and the specification of materials. The issue, and I don't know the solution, I'd like to provide a solution, but the issue is if we specify materials too early on, or we're very specific too early on, what we're finding now, we're consented, we're underway on site, is suddenly the tanky membrane isn't available. And because it is a compliance item, we're having to do a building consent amendment. So that's the issue we're facing as designers by specifying or being too specific. So for windows, we might draw a generic window profile. And but if we're suddenly putting in glass balustrades, we have to provide a producer statement for consent. And then suddenly that balustrade system isn't available while it's under construction. That is actually a consent amendment. And you can just imagine the time needed to undertake the work, let alone the consenting piece. And that consent amendment just gets put in the same queue as every other building consent. So I think as an industry, we need to look at how we could change that to where major changes like an envelope or as roofing or a membrane is more like a minor variation. We've got highly trained and skilled contractors and consultants on site that can actually make these decisions. It's just we need to disrupt how it's then approved back through a consenting process.
Bruce, have you got any comments there around that working with the supply chain?
Yeah, look, I feel like we're going over the same answers. The earlier engagement helps. I think the need to look at large projects and get that information from architect specifiers all the way through supply chain. Reality is our industry has worked in a particular way for quite some time. And it is going to require us to work differently. It's going to require us to share information a lot earlier and in different ways, perhaps, than we have in the past. And so for me, the more we can join those dots, the earlier, the simpler it becomes.
Yep. There seemed to be two schools of thoughts that came through in the survey. Shane's actually summarised one nicely. As a supplier, we're taking the risk and putting the dollars on the table first in the hope the specification carries through to a sale in 12 to 18 months' time. So there's a large portion of people saying we need stronger specifications, better project management or forecasting by particularly architects. So they can actually follow that through the stages towards obviously construction installation. But there's also another group of saying make it easier for substitution. So can we effectively have more options for people to if there are delays that they've actually got some choice. So I think two schools of thought there. Both have a lot of merit. But certainly that what we're hearing is that early engagement is certainly a big part that we can improve as a collaborative. So let's now move on to sort of more forward thinking. So areas for innovation or opportunities for us to approach our supply model, the life cycle of a project, and think about what are the areas that are a bit more difficult to do, but could have some real meaningful impact on how we can deliver projects successfully. Who wants to kick this off?
Just before you get into that, there's one thing I just wanted to add. I think partly we're talking about what we can do, but I think the other thing we also need to think about is how do we honestly face up to the current situation? And the report you've done is really helpful, because what it's saying is we are going to have some supply chain disruption for some time now. And we're going to have increased costs for a period going forward. The thing that worries me particularly is how builders, and excuse me if I take that particular viewpoint, is how they price jobs, and in particular not being talked into fixed price quotes for jobs that could take over well over a year in some cases. You don't know what's going to happen. Clients will want a fixed price. I understand that. But builders like to help people. They try and get things done. But you have to preserve your margin and be very, very wary. I heard an anecdote recently of a builder had a client come to them and said, they wanted a fixed price. They've got from someone else to give a fixed price. Could they give one? Yep. And they said, well, hold on. You haven't even got access to the title yet. You don't know when that's going to happen. There's going to be delays. If you've got a fixed price, good luck. Go for it. There's no way I'm sacrificing my business. I really think we do need to focus on this is a different environment, and how from a business point of view do you deal with that over the next little period of time? Yep. When we look ahead, I think this might be a point where there will be some changes in practice. And I know Stephen's talked about the consenting model. I 100% agree. We've got to change that consenting model. It's one of there is some good work happening, but to my mind, there's some short-term stuff, and then there's a longer-term change. Yep. I think in the short term, we need to think about what can you do for yourself? What can you do differently that will help you get through the consent process, for instance? So there is some stuff you do need to, because the process is not going to change in the short term. So what can you do differently? But then how do we as an industry push for that momentum to make significant change in things like consenting, so that we don't waste this opportunity to make change? I'm sure there's some other areas. I'm sure, Bruce, from a supplier point of view, you'll be thinking quite hard about how do you cope with this, not just now, but for the future.
Yeah, I think you're spot on, David. There's a now problem and a longer term problem, and as an industry, we need to solve the short term issues, but we also need to look at, we're not going to solve the consenting process in the next 6 to 12 months, but we absolutely need to start that process. Stephen talked about substitutions, and I see a number of the comments about making the substitution process a lot easier. We absolutely need to do that. But I think we've just got to think in two speeds about what can we do today to ease the current challenges, be it this week, this month, and then what do we do long term? How do we not waste this this challenge, this crisis, to change the industry and how it works?
100% agree on the fixed price, and this, especially in this market, and we can't find anyone to give us a fixed price anymore. Projects are 2 years long, and it's just impossible. There's certain parts that you can fix, and you might say, well, let's you concrete and steel or something, but the early stuff, but you might fix 50% of it and you have a cost plus and agree to margin through to the end. So we definitely support that, and engaging a contractor earlier on is we're on the ride together as consultants and contractors, and the consenting officers as well. An area that I like to work in is around digital and pushing what we can do with digitizing our processes. And yes, we can't do much around consenting now, but you can imagine the majority of professionals are producing models or digital models of projects. They're called digital twins. If those digital twins were used in the future for actually using your consent, and then you even go one step further, and this is really blue sky thinking, but we need to set a path into changing our vertical industry into something that's more a manufactured process. It would give suppliers certainty. I mean, you only have to look at how a plane is manufactured. I mean, our houses should be done the same way. Your models would then be used for consenting. You would lodge with your models, used for the manufacturing. You'd actually use it for facilities maintenance and so forth. If the country headed down that path, that it would start to automate what we do. And I know the Fletchers, they do it in their prefabrication plant out there, and you got Concision. We worked on a project where we did pre or offsite manufacturing for bathroom pods, and that came out of New Zealand and some out of Australia. And they were all consented early and using three-dimensional models. So it can be done, and it just needs the will, really.
Team, I think we're going to have to wrap up now. Fantastic discussion, and lots of comments on the chat and Q&A that we didn't manage to get to, but I can see there's some advice around exemptions both for travel and actually for companies operating. So if you just want to scroll through that, you can find some information. I think if we just, in terms of summarising, we've got obviously a big day tomorrow with level 3 in the rest of the country. So as an industry, let's make sure that we're well prepared. We're highly visible. So let's all work together and do a good job, and think about those supply chain constraints, and working with with your suppliers to make sure that you can get your expectations hopefully met as accurately as possible. We've got a longer term view where we're going to have to be dealing with these, what they call them, headwinds, but it's going to take better communication and collaboration for us to get through this. Marty had a comment that this is all getting too hard, I might as well just pack up and retire. No, Marty, that's not what we need. We need to work through this collectively. We've got a labour shortage as it is, so Marty, hang in there. And look, there's been 800 of us on this call today, so what a great opportunity to share these thoughts. And the onus is on all of us to see if we can take some responsibility ourselves to try and enact some change. So what we can do at an individual level within our company and promoting our industry organisation. So hopefully there's a few sparks here that we've ignited. So Bruce, Stephen and David, thank you so much for your time today. It's been great having this discussion. For those of you that are interested, next Tuesday I'll do a deeper dive into our survey report, which is available on the EBOSS website. So everyone, enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks again for tuning in, and look forward to a robust and solid restart. So enjoy your afternoon. Thanks all.